Many Christians know that the Apostle Paul worked to support himself as a tent maker while preaching the gospel and starting churches throughout the Roman Empire. And in fact, from that, we have taken the word tent making as a metaphor for working in an everyday job in order to do cross-cultural missionary work. What this means is that Paul was actually an everyday working man, like the vast majority of us Christians. Tent making was used regularly in early centuries to spread the gospel. People worked to support themselves wherever they went as they shared the gospel of Christ. But in recent centuries, it was replaced by full-time donor-supported missionary work. However, tent making has been revived in the latter part of the 20th century as an access strategy for missionaries to enter closed countries which do not grant missionary visas. As a result of this, many missionaries are going essentially as missionaries and undercover. But what was Paul really doing? Now, it's very interesting. I love tools. I have lots of tools. And one of the things that I've discovered is that you can use tools in different ways. And one very simple tool that I've used a lot is a level. And there are times when I just need a straight edge. And I don't have anything else. And so I'll use a level to draw a straight line for some project that I'm working on. But that's only a very small part of what a level can do. And in fact, the level's not the best for that because it's too wide. But what a level can do is it can help level floors or things that you're pouring. It can make walls vertical and so on like that. So it has tremendous capacity when it's used for its full purpose. The same thing is true of tent making. Tent making is much more than an access strategy for closed countries. But if we're to understand it, we need to understand what Paul really did. So what did Paul really do, and why did he do it? Most of us think of Paul as kind of a full-time missionary who worked a little bit when he had to. In fact, that was what I thought when I came to Global Opportunities. But Ruth Siemens kept saying to me, Dave, yes, but what does the record say? What does the New Testament record say? Look at it more. And so over the years I did that, and boy, what an insight that has given. So encouraging to those of us who are everyday Christians and what God can do through us in the world. So let me start by talking about Paul's 3 missionary journeys. I'm not going to go through them all because you can see the detailed passages in the notes, in the session notes, which you can download from that link right there on the screen. In fact, why don't we just take a break? And if you haven't downloaded that, why don't you download it now? And I'll be right here when you get back. I'm not going anywhere. Almost everybody knows that Paul went on 3 missionary journeys. Let's talk about those 3 journeys. And you'll see in your notes the references, the text that talk about Paul's working for a living during each of those 3 journeys. And as I said, I'm not going to go through all that, but I want to highlight some things. Look at the 2nd missionary journey, where Paul was, which Paul writes about when he writes back to the church at Thessalonica. And in that passage in 2 Thessalonians, he says that we work night and day in order not to be a burden to you. Now, what does Paul mean by night and day? Of course, you realize Paul didn't know anything about 20th or 21st century expressions. And so he didn't know anything about our using night and day for being a workaholic. So Paul is talking in his own language, in his own context. And what he's talking about is the 2 parts of the workday in the ancient world in the Mediterranean. People would work in the morning until about noon when it began to get hot. And then they would take a long break during the heat of the day till about 3 or 4 o'clock, and then they'd return to work in the late afternoon and work through the evening and knock off maybe around 8 o'clock or so, maybe later sometimes, and eat, clean up, and so on. So essentially what they did is they switched the workday around so that their break was in the middle of the day, which had other advantages as well. And so what Paul is essentially saying is that he worked both work shifts of the day. In other words, Paul is saying that he worked basically full time. Now, the second thing he says in the passage is really interesting, is that we did not take anybody's food or shelter, I think he says, without paying. Paul and his team refused to accept hospitality without paying for it. This is how serious Paul was about being self-supporting. Now, the third thing I want you to notice in this really exciting passage to me is that he says the words we, us, and our 8 times in just 2 verses, verses 7 and 8 of 2 Thessalonians 3, referring to who? To himself, to Timothy, and Silas, because they worked together as a team. So all 3 of them worked while they were there in Thessalonica. He says the same thing, by the way, in 1 Thessalonians. So we learned then that Paul worked full time, that he was so serious about this, so committed about funding his own ministry that he wouldn't even take ongoing hospitality, and third, that his whole team practiced the same pattern. And then just one thing I really like in which he talks about his whole 3 journeys is a statement that he makes in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, where he says, to the present hour we labor, working with our own hands. And here he's saying near the end of all his journeys, because the book of Corinthians is written near the end of all his journeys, he's saying we are continuing to work, just as we have in the past, just as and by implication has been our policy throughout all our journeys. So even these very brief passages is pretty clear that he worked his whole ministry, that he worked full time, that his whole team practiced this, and then there is one more implication. You realize that Paul and his team is what the book of Acts follows under the inspiration of the Spirit to tell about the major expansion of the church beyond Jerusalem and Judea. That means that the model that the New Testament follows is one of everyday working people carrying the gospel, supporting themselves into the ancient world, and expanding the gospel very rapidly winning people to Christ and starting churches. And just think of the implications of that. It doesn't follow those who were full-time workers, but under the inspiration of the Spirit, this is the primary model that's given. And this should be very encouraging and exciting to us. So let's go and look further. And to even drive this home and even make it more clear, the most powerful passage in all the New Testament is 1 Corinthians 9. It is pivotal to understanding what Paul did and why he did it. Why is it pivotal? 2 reasons. One is because this is written at the end of all of Paul's missionary journeys, when he is at Ephesus. And near the end of his time at Ephesus, where he spent several years, the longest period of any of his journeys, any of the churches that he stayed at. By the way, as he stays there, other little teams are going out and starting other churches in other areas. So Paul was not just working at that church, though he was focusing on that church, but they were working on reaching other cities in that area. But what's really significant here, this is near the end of all his journey. So 1 Corinthians 9 covers all of his missionary ministry in Acts, up until the time he is essentially arrested and then goes to Rome under house arrest. The second reason that it's so important is that Paul is forced to defend his self-support, that he did not take support, but rather work for his own living. Because you see, what happened is that there were false teachers who came to Corinth following behind Paul, and they began to tell the Corinthian church that they had to keep the law now that they were Christians. If they were really going to be saved, God's really going to be satisfied with them, they had to keep the law. Well, how far would Paul go along with that kind of teaching? He wouldn't give it the time of day, because that undermines and destroys the grace of God in the gospel, that people are saved by grace through faith. And so Paul has to counter the attack of these false teachers who are trying to undermine him. So what they do, if they're ever to get the people at Corinth to follow their false teaching, The only way they can do it is to discredit Paul. They use various points to discredit him, one of which is that he's not a very powerful preacher, and there are other more powerful preachers. But then the most important one is that they argue that Paul is not a real apostle because nobody supports him. Nobody endorses him. And so Paul begins by saying, am I not a real apostle? Have I not seen Jesus, our Lord? One of the requirements for an apostle is that they've seen the risen Lord. And Paul, of course, saw him on the road to Damascus. And he says, and if I'm not apostle to everybody, which he is, at least I am to you because you owe your very salvation to me, that you ever came to know Jesus. And then he goes on to give the strongest argument in all of Scripture for his right to be supported, not just his right, but the right of all people who work full-time, so that when the church is asking and expecting people to care for them and to give their full time to ministry, it then is their obligation and their duty to take care of them. And he argues from the Old Testament, he argues from taking care of the ox that treads out the corn, he argues from the priests in the Old Testament who are to be taken care of by the rest of Israel, and he gives these very strong arguments. You can almost imagine the Corinthian Christians saying, oh boy, we really should have supported Paul. But you know what Paul says? He says, I'm not writing now to get the use of that right. In fact, 3 times he says, I never use that right. Verse 12, if others share this rightful claim upon you, do not we still more? In other words, we have more of a claim than they ever would. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. But we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Very interesting statement, by the way. We'll come back to it later. What was the obstacle? Then verse 15 says, but I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing this to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground of boasting. Finally, in verse 18 he says, what then is my reward? Just this, that in my preaching I may make the gospel free of charge, not making full use of my right in the gospel. So, Paul, after giving the strongest argument for his claim upon financial support, says 3 times, I never used it. And he's so passionate about it that I don't want anybody to ever take away my boast or his claim that he made the gospel free. And when he says he made the gospel free, he means I didn't make any money for my ministry. I provided my ministry of the gospel. I provided it free. So very, very clear, very powerful. The New Testament that is unequivocal. Remember, this is written at the end of his journeys. As this problem comes up, late in his time at Ephesus, problem comes up at Corinth. There's a case of immorality, but the biggest problem are these false teachers that could lead his people away. He writes then 1 Corinthians and then 2 Corinthians, and in 2 Corinthians he has to return to this issue again. And again he argues that he loved them so much that he just wanted to provide the gospel for them, free of charge, and so on. Some of you are aware perhaps of a couple of problem texts in the New Testament. The first one is in Acts 18:5 in some versions. For instance, the NIV says that when Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, implying that up until then he had been forced to work. And the implication is that he brought a gift from the churches in Macedonia. In fact, 2 Corinthians confirms that he brought a gift from the churches in Macedonia. And so the NIV translated it that Paul at that point devoted himself exclusively to preaching, whereas he had not been before. But what is he actually saying? Well, what have we already seen? And what he says earlier in 1 Corinthians, he has said very clearly that he never took support, and he would not take support lest anybody take away his claim that he's made the gospel free. And we've seen all these passages throughout the New Testament that it was his standard operating procedure to support himself and not take support, and it was the pattern, and in fact it was the policy of his whole team. So we know that there must be something wrong with this translation. We should at least suspect it. Well, it's actually very easily solved by just having a better translation. For instance, the Revised Standard Version and other versions translate it something like this. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with preaching, just as he was always doing wherever he went. He was already preaching. They found him preaching. In other words, he did not wait for them. With his passion for the gospel, he was continuing preaching even as he was working, which he continued to do in Corinth. And in fact, in Corinth, it was where he met Aquila and Priscilla, and we have one of the more extended stories to give us a picture of how Paul worked in the workshop, because this adds the fact that two key leaders that he developed, Aquila and Priscilla, were also tent makers, and for that reason he stayed with them. Now, the more serious problem text, perhaps, is 2 Corinthians 11:8, where Paul says to the Corinthians, when he has to write back the second time to them to try to straighten out the problems there, and again he's having to defend his working for a living. And throughout this passage, in the context, he talks about, I preached without cost. I loved you like a father, or as your father, and like a father provides for his children, and not the children for the father, so I provided for you. I loved you in that way. And then he goes on to say at one point that I robbed churches in order to serve you and to bring you the gospel. What does he mean by rob churches? Well, first of all, he couldn't possibly mean that there would be anything wrong with taking support from churches, because he's already given us the clear statement in all of Scripture that those who work in full-time ministry deserve to be supported. In fact, it's a duty to support them. So he must be exaggerating in some way. He must mean something else. And here's what I think makes sense of it. It's actually his policy of never taking support, of always funding his own ministry, working for his own living. The second problem text, which is probably more significant, is 2 Corinthians 11:8, where Paul says that he robbed churches in order to serve Corinth, in order to bring the gospel to them. But now, what do we already know about Paul's understanding of support and the right of those who work full-time to support? Well, he fully supported it. In fact, he gives us the strongest argument in all Scripture of the obligation of the church to support its workers, that it has worked full-time. So he can't possibly be saying there was anything wrong with the church supporting him. So it's some kind of obvious exaggeration. And also, let me go on further to say in this context that he again talks about, as he has to defend himself for the second time against the claims of the Judaizers about not receiving support. So he has to make another defense of that, and he says that he preached the gospel without cost. And he says, in fact, he says, did I wrong you by loving you too much, that I made the gospel free to you? And he goes on to say that I loved you as a father, and a father takes care of his children, and the children don't take care of the father. And that's the way I loved you. And so in that context, he says, I even went so far that I robbed churches in order to serve you. Now we can begin to understand what he's getting at, because what he's arguing is precisely that he was making the gospel free, and that he was providing it from his own work, and his own co-workers did the same thing. And so what he means is simply that he violated his normal policy of refusing to take support but supporting himself. He says, I love you so much that I made an exception to my general policy, and I robbed churches by then taking support and accepting a few gifts. And because I was anxious to get on in serving you and loving you, I made an exception to my usual policy of doing it. So, now it becomes very clear, doesn't it, that Paul worked for his living during all his ministry. that he worked full-time. Further, this was his passionate policy, and we want to look at why he was so passionate about this. It was also the practice of his whole team. All of them did the same thing. And as we go further, that probably includes as many as 20 to 24 people who were co-workers with him, going out in small teams to different cities to plant churches, as many as 20 to 24 people, including Luke, Barnabas also having been a co-worker, and planting churches throughout the Roman Empire. And all of them followed that same practice. So then we have, the implication of this is that this is the primary model that the New Testament follows for the expansion of the church. And that expansion was very effective and very rapid. So let's look at why Paul did this. So why did Paul do this, and why was he so passionate about it? I think you'll find his reasons really compelling and profound, very powerful reasons. Let me just give you the reasons that he talks about in various passages in the New Testament. First reason he talks about is divine reward. He says this in 1 Corinthians 9, verses 15 to 18. What then is my reward? Just this, that in my preaching I may make the gospel free of charge, not making full use of my right in the gospel. And he goes on to explain, this is a rather complicated section to understand because of the way the Greek comes across in English, but the force of it is this. Paul says, if I preach the gospel and I get paid and supported to do it, I would be doing what was my duty and responsibility to do. Christ has called me. And I would not deserve any special reward. I'd be being paid for my services. He says, however, if I do it freely, by which he means is I do it just by paying for it myself as a volunteer, because a volunteer does not get paid, then I have this extra reward that I made the gospel free of charge. I didn't have to do that. But he said I wanted to serve God and loved Christ in that way, that I would make the gospel free of charge and not use my right to support. And I think part of it is Paul felt such thankfulness to God for his grace that he ever would forgive him and reconcile him to himself after all he did to chase down the church, to take their property and to have Christians executed. So he says, it's my joy, this is the reward that I have of giving it away free. The second reason he gives is his fatherly love. We've already touched on this. He says, I will not be a burden, for I seek not what is yours, but you. For children are not obligated to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for your souls. And there are actually several references where he talks about that. The third reason that he gives, I believe, is credibility. Remember what we read earlier, that we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel. Well, how would taking support be an obstacle to the gospel? Well, think about it. How do you think about people when you know that they are being paid to do spiritual or religious work? Isn't it easy to say, well, they get paid to do that? And I was in university staff. Students used to say to me, some of my students from Johns Hopkins, who were very open with me with their opinions. I remember teaching at one weekend, very powerful weekend training that we had on the Lordship of Christ and getting started and following Christ and in evangelism. And when I got done, the Hopkins students said to me, well, Dave, that's easy for you to say. You get paid to be spiritual. And it was funny, but there's a real element of truth in it as well. Because the fact was that I did get paid to be spiritual. It was part of my job description. They, however, as they began to follow Christ with more and more commitment and obedience and more also fruitfulness, they did that in the midst of all the pressures, the academic pressures of Johns Hopkins, the social pressures of Johns Hopkins. And God honored that. It was great. But they did it freely. They didn't do it in any way as a job description. So there's a more compelling witness to how they did it. And I love one of the stories that Ari tells about what happened when he was working in China. And after this Bible study group got going in his home, and Chinese just coming to their home, investigating Jesus in the scriptures, and they were friends, and he said to them, you know, there are a lot of missionaries here who you know about. What do you think about them? Oh, we think they're wonderful. We respect them. We think they're good people. He said, but what do you think about their work and about their message? They said, oh, one of them said, they get paid to preach. Another one said, oh, they get paid to make converts. And while that might not have been entirely unfair, they understood that that was how they made their living, and to a significant extent, they discounted their message. But one of the things that is really powerful is when we are communicating and sharing the gospel as unpaid witnesses. I mean, who do you trust more? The used car salesman or the satisfied customer? So that is one of the things I think that Paul realized. And there were a lot of people in the Roman Empire making their living by going around and preaching and philosophizing and so on. Then we come to the fourth reason, which I think is the most powerful of all and probably central to the whole thing. Paul says, this great famous passage that is used in missions as the great passage on identifying with the people. You could say, some use the word contextualizing the gospel, entering their world in their culture, to explain the gospel in their culture. He says, I become all things to all people, that I might by all means save some. And of course, in that section, you may remember that Paul talks about becoming like a Jew to the Jews, like a Greek to the Greeks, becoming weak to those who are weak. In other words, he tried in every way he could to identify with the people that he worked with, so that they might see and understand the gospel and hear it from him. And in the context of 1 Corinthians 9, this is perhaps the climactic reason he gives about why he gave up his right to support, so that he could become all things to all people. Why? Well, think about it. Working for a living is one of the simplest and most profound ways of identifying with people in any culture, because this is such a big part of human life, working for a living. And by doing that, Paul became an everyday working man. And in that context, he demonstrated the power of the gospel in his life. You know, nobody could say, like they said to me, well, it's easy to be spiritual when you're paid to be spiritual. Oh no, he faced all the pressures of work. He knew what it was like to be exhausted and still have to respond in a godly way, and he did. I'm sure he knew what it was like to be cheated. I'm sure he knew what it was like to come to work sick, but he had to get some project done for a deadline, and he had to finish. I know what it was like probably at times he had to be patient with his co-workers, and probably some of them were part of his team who worked with him in his workshop. And so people saw Paul's life, godliness, Christ-likeness in how he worked. He exhibited Christ. And that is very powerful, because he was just bringing the gospel freely. He wasn't getting paid, and he was having to work, and in fact had enormous pressures at times, because that says he didn't have a great deal of money. He was never wealthy, lived a simple life, and so on. So what Paul is doing is he is incarnating the gospel. It is show and tell. He demonstrates the gospel as an everyday Christian, not as a full-timer, but as an everyday Christian, and showing that it really works in real life, under the real pressures, and in the real joys, and the real satisfaction of work that people experience. And we could add one more thing, that in the ancient Roman Empire, there was generally a very bad work ethic, a very low view of work. The great thing would be to be in leadership, or to be able to think about philosophy and about life and so on, and having to do manual labor was looked down upon. But Paul knew better, and he knew that as people made the image of God, that work is good, and he demonstrated, and we need to do our work well with excellence and really serve the people we're working for. There's a corollary to that. When you enter people's world by working, you naturally rub shoulders with them. You kind of become one of them. But you're in contact with them regularly. You have natural contact with non-believers who are precisely the people that need Jesus. So Paul was able to talk about the gospel right in the workplace. And we know that he did this by what we read in Acts, I think it's 19, where he's talking to the elders of Ephesus on the beach at Miletus, when he's making his final trip through the churches, collecting money for the church in Jerusalem, which was going through famine. And he doesn't have much time, but he knows that this will be the last time he talks with them. And he meets with them on the beach. At least that's the way I imagine it. And one of the things he makes a big point of is how he worked for a living. And also, he says, you will remember that I charged you night and day about following Christ. And but what do we know about what he was doing night and day? What was night and day? It was the two work shifts of the day. So how was he charging these leaders of Ephesus night and day? Well, what it means is they were visiting him in his workshop. And before they became leaders, they were new converts, growing. And I'm sure they were there in the workshop with them. I'm sure some of them he was witnessing to in the workshop. He also, of course, was preaching the gospel at first in the synagogue, and then later in Ephesus he used the school of Tyrannus, it says. He apparently rented it during the midday break, and he would preach there. Another interesting thing in that passage, it talks about people carrying away his work clothes, his apron, and his a word that kind of describes the cloth he might have used to wipe his hands, and maybe the sweat, and they would carry it away. And during that period, God chose to heal people through that method. That we know from research is that that's the way the gospel works. That's the way it travels. It travels networks of relationships. The vast majority of people who come to Christ, 80% or more, come primarily through the influence of friends and family. Furthermore, if you have all Christians engaged in this way, that means that the gospel is getting into all sectors of society, all parts of society. All right, the fifth reason that follows right from the previous. If Paul is identifying and demonstrating the gospel, well, one of the results of that is then he is immediately a model of discipleship. He is a model of following Christ. And so very interestingly, do you know what Paul's method of discipling was? It boils down to two words that he uses in some form or other in 6 or 7 times in the New Testament. So this was Paul's method. It was this: imitate me. Paul understood that that is the way people really learn new patterns of living. They imitate somebody. This is the way we are as human beings. And so Paul says, imitate me. I'm living before you a life of love and devotion to Christ, and of love and service to people, of excellence in work, and in all areas of life. He's living and demonstrating what it means to love and follow Jesus. He says, imitate me, copy me. So Paul modeled, just to touch on what he modeled. He modeled godliness in all of life. Paul understood that God owned all of life and all of him, and so all of life is to be honoring to him. So all relationships with those in authority, with customers, with suppliers of the stuff that he needed, and so on, co-workers. And so he did this in work, he did it in his friendships, he did it in family relationships, so we don't know a lot about Paul's extended family. And of course, then the third area that he did it in was his witness. Paul integrated work and witness. We've already begun to look at that. And so Paul was winning and discipling people, not only through the times that he preached in the hall of Tyrannus or in a synagogue. He was doing it right in his workplace. And he also did it from house to house. He did it in the normal course of all his everyday relationships. So think about then the implication of this. What was the impact? Paul made it normal for everyday Christians to make disciples. This is just what a normal Christian does. So did his co-workers. None of them were supported. None of them were full-time. They were all everyday Christians working just like they were, and he models what it is to live out the gospel and to carry the gospel to others right in everyday life. So all these early Christians who came to faith through Paul and his colleagues, they didn't know anything different. They thought that was normal Christian life. For everybody to be serious about discipleship, about following Jesus, and about making disciples. This is why there was such an explosion. Can you see it? I mean, it's just no wonder there was such an explosion of the church and the gospel in the ancient world. Now, not only did Paul and his team model multiplication, disciple making by all Christians, there's another secret of what Paul was doing. He modeled the multiplication of everyday leaders, of what we would call today lay leaders. But of course in that day there were no lay leaders because there's no clergy. Everybody was just an everyday Christian. Even those who began to be supported full-time, they were some of that class. But this is very significant. Paul rapidly multiplied leaders because he expected everyday Christians to be making disciples. And then among those, some of these Christians, as they grew, they just really did exhibit Christ, and there was a Christ likeness in them that people could see in them and follow them and imitate them. And then also, people began to see certain ones as leaders, as just really helping them to move forward in Christ. And Paul then and his team very quickly recognized leaders. It's fascinating to see in the New Testament that Paul went back on a second pass by the churches, not even that many weeks or months later, and appointed, by recognizing in the church those that had risen to leadership because of their godliness and because people were following them. And so you had very rapid multiplication of leaders because that was all that was required. They didn't have to wait for people to raise money to be full-time, or for the church to have enough money to hire them full-time. They didn't have to wait for them to go to seminary or Bible school. The qualifications were basically godliness and following of Christ. And secondly, that people were following them. They were helping people forward in their walk with Christ. So that God has opened us wide open for all of us to be fully engaged in what he is doing in the world. And the Great Commission Jesus called to us is a call to all of us, not only to pray and give, but to go, to find our place in the reaching of the nations of the world. And Jesus promises that when we do this, when we fully embrace this call, he says, "Lo, I am with you until the end of the age." I just am happy for you spending this time with me, and I just want to invite you to respond by contacting me or contacting Go, and if you haven't done so already, go to Tentmaking 101, download and read those, and then begin to make steps as God speaks to your heart. Thank you.